Evil grin. When I was 12 years old, I had a best friend named Brenda. After school we always went to her house to hang out. She lived in a big house on the edge of town. One day, Brenda didn't show up for school. She was absent for the next few days and I began wondering if there was something was wrong with her. After she had missed a whole week of school, I decided to pay her a visit. I cycled all the way across town and arrived at her house just as it was getting dark outside. When I rang the doorbell, I got a shock when the door opened almost immediately. Brenda's mother was standing in the doorway, but there was something strange about her. Her eyes seemed darker than usual and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders. I noticed that she was wearing a bathrobe. The most unsettling thing was the way she was grinning at me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there staring at me with an evil smile playing across her lips. "Is Brenda here?" I asked, nervously. She beckoned at me to come in and before I could say anything, she had slipped back into the darkened house. As I stepped inside, my eyes strained to see in the darkness, but I wasn't sure where she had gone. Just then, I heard a strange humming sound and followed it into the kitchen. I found her there, standing at the kitchen sink with her back towards me. The moment I entered the kitchen, she stopped humming and there was an eerie silence. I took a seat at the kitchen table and waited. She seemed to be taking forever. I spent the next 5 minutes just sitting there, wondering what was going on. Then I realized something very odd. The whole time I had been sitting there, she hadn't moved a muscle. Her back was still towards me and I couldn't see her face. Her hands hung limp by her sides and her head was tilted slightly. Something was very wrong. I stood up nervously and approached her. She remained completely still. Ever so slowly, I moved around her and tried to get a look at her face to see if she was all right. The sight still haunts me to this very day. Her eyes were wide open and she still had that evil grin on her face. I was so freaked out that I couldn't bear to stay in the kitchen a moment longer. Without saying a word, I backed out of the room and made my way towards the front door. I jumped on my bike and began cycling as fast as I could down the long, winding driveway and all the way across town. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my house. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out why my friend Brenda had been absent from school. My parents told me that there had been a tragic death in Brenda's family. "What?" I asked. "Who died?" My parents broke the sad news to me and it made my hair stand on end and I was crying from fright. Brenda's mother had died suddenly and the night I called over to her house, Brenda had been at her grandparents' place, attending the funeral. Years later, when I was 16 years old, I made a little extra money by working as a babysitter on weekends. One evening, a friend of mine called me and said she knew a family who desperately needed a babysitter. She was busy and wanted to know if I was interested in babysitting for them instead. She told me the parents were very nice, the pay was good and their 3-year-old daughter was polite and well behaved. I wasn't doing anything important so I told her I would be glad to take the job. That evening, I went to the family's house and met the mother. Her name was Ruth and she was getting ready to go out for the night with friends. She mentioned that her husband was out of town on business and gave me some numbers to call if I needed to get in touch with her. The night went very easily. I made dinner for the little girl, gave her a bubble bath, then got her dressed for bed. I was around midnight when I heard the front door open and footsteps coming down the hallway. I thought it was strange, because I hadn't even heard a car pull up. Turning around, I was relieved to see Ruth making her way into the living room where I was sitting watching TV. She never said a word to me, and, as she walked past me, I was surprised by how different she looked. Something about her eyes had changed and she was grinning from ear to ear. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that evil grin. I had seen it before, many years ago. Ruth sat at the dining table with her back turned towards me. Her hands hung limp by her sides. Her head was cocked to the left. She was humming to herself. "Ruth," I asked, nervously. "Ruth, are you all right?" No answer. "Ruth, you're not alive anymore, are you?" Silence. With shaking hands, I quickly gathered my things and backed out of the room. When I got to the hallway, I opened the front door and looked outside. There was no car in the driveway. All of a sudden, the eerie silence was broken by the sound of the phone ringing. I didn't want to answer it. I was afraid of what I might hear. For a moment, my hand seemed to hover over the phone. Then I lifted the receiver and put it to my ear. I already knew who it was. It was the police, calling to tell me that Ruth had been involved in a car accident an hour ago. She had been killed on impact. Tears were streaming down my face as I ran upstairs, grabbed Ruth's daughter from her bed and bundled her up in her blanket. As came back downstairs, I had to pass by the door to the living room. I could still see Ruth sitting at the table with her back to me. Without pausing for a second, I ran out into the night, carrying the little girl in my arms. Wedding album. There was a young couple who had just gotten married. The wedding was wonderful and they took many photos so that they would remember the happy occasion forever. For their honeymoon, they traveled to France and stayed in a dark old mansion. The first night, the young woman felt scared, and despite her husband's attempts to reassure her, she could not sleep. To clear her head, she decided to go downstairs to the library and read a little. She selected a book at random from the dusty old shelves, and opened it. Inside, there were only pictures. Pictures of her. The pictures were from her wedding. The woman was shocked at first, but then she thought about it. Her husband must have put together a wedding album as a surprise for her. He was probably planning to give it to her the next day. She flipped through the pictures in the album, her mind going back to how wonderful the wedding day had been. When she reached the end of the album, there were more pages with pictures, but they were not of the wedding. In fact, she wondered what these strange pictures were doing in the album. It seemed as if they had been stapled in. The first page showed a picture of a woman standing in a library, holding a book in her hands. On the second page, there was another picture of the woman, but this time, the library door was open. Feeling a little uneasy, she turned to look at the door. It was closed. On the third page of the book, the door was wide open and a faceless man was standing behind the woman. Again, she glanced over her shoulder, but the door was closed. Flipping to the last page of the book, she saw that, in the picture, the faceless man was standing right behind the woman, his arm raised and clutching a knife. The next morning, the husband woke up and could not find his wife. He decided to search the house, but when he got to the library, he found the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. Putting all of his weight behind it, he pushed against the door with his shoulder and eventually, it burst open. Behind the door, he found his wife lying in a pool of blood. There was a knife sticking out of her back. Pillow. There was a young girl named Alicia who moved, with her parents, to a new town. They rented a big, old house that was sparsely furnished. Alicia slept in the downstairs bedroom while her parents slept upstairs. After they had been living there a few weeks, Alicia's parents noticed that she was growing very thin. As the days went on, her health seemed to get worse and worse. Then, the poor girl came down with a mysterious illness and was confined to her bed. The doctor came to examine her and he told her parents that she was suffering from anemia. All she needed was some rest, he said, and soon she would be as good as new. However, despite what the doctor said, Alicia's condition continued to get worse and worse. Her skin was gray and pallid, her cheeks were sunken and there were dark circles around her eyes. Her parents were distraught and had no idea what to do. While Alicia slept in her bed, her mother and father paced back and forth restlessly, wondering what could be the cause of her mysterious illness. Day by day and hour by hour, the poor girl grew worse and worse. She was so weak, she could barely move. Alicia was fading fast and the life was ebbing from her veins. She was deathly pale and her body was shriveled and withered. She started to have hallucinations and began screaming out in terror and babbling incoherently in a weak voice. Finally, Alicia lost consciousness and died. Her parents were inconsolable. They held a funeral service and buried their beloved daughter in the town cemetery. The day after the funeral, Alicia's mother was stripping the sheets off her daughter's bed when she noticed something on the pillow. There were 2 red stains in the white material. When she picked up the pillow, she noticed it was unusually heavy, so she called her husband to come and take a look at it. As the parents examined the pillow closely, the mother suddenly let out a scream. She felt something moving inside it. The father fetched a knife and slit open the pillow, emptying the feathers out on the floor. As the parents watched in horror, something crawled out of the pile of feathers, slowly moving its hairy legs. It was a monstrous black spider, so swollen with blood that they could scarcely make out its mouth. Night after night, as Alicia lay in bed, this hairy abomination had been stealthily sucking all of the blood from her body and slowly draining her life away.